Hello everyone. Hope you can see. Okay, so this is the Intro to Web Debugging Workshop that comes right after the Intro to Web Dev Workshop. So if you were just there for Jenny's wonderful workshop, you are on a very good starting point. So welcome, thank you for coming. Disclaimer. Although this workshop is beginner friendly, it may be a bit overwhelming if you've never been exposed to web development. With that being said, like 95% of the code is already written for you. It will just be basically a debugging walkthrough. So don't worry. All material will be on the Notion page and the link will be in the next 2 slides. And if you have any questions, please send them to Debugging Workshop on Discord and a TA will help you. Now we are introducing the wonderful workshop TAs. So first off, we have Ian, who's an internal dev at nwPlus. And then we also have Maggie, who is a HackCamp coordinator. So you probably saw her before. We also have Andy, who's also an internal dev, as well as Anne, our wonderful co-president. Who am I? I'm Stephanie. This is my first year in nwPlus, and I am a Command F coordinator. Some pre-workshop setup notes. If you got the Learn Hacker Info package, you probably already saw this, but the main thing is to have VS Code installed or any other text editor, as well as to clone the repo. If you need help with any of this, please ask a TA. And then all workshop information is at tinyurl.com/debuggingworkshop. It's basically a Notion page. It contains like step-by-step info on how this workshop is being run. So if you ever get stuck, please refer there. I will just show you something that you can do if you've already done all of this. If you want, you can actually go into VS Code, and then if you see index.html, you can actually change this to reflect yourself, maybe like a sentence. And then also you can go into script.js and fill in some fun facts about yourself. And with that being said, I'll just jump right into the workshop content itself. So why is this workshop important? Well, as you may or may not know, debugging is 99% of software engineering and dev. So if you haven't run into debugging already, you will be very soon. It's a super important skill to have as a developer, and this will be a very beginner workshop to debugging common issues in front-end web development. So we hope that this will help you build up like the very basic intuition behind debugging or even Googling or Stack Overflowing. And by the end of this workshop, you'll have debugged a super simple static personal website. And if you're feeling up for a challenge, we're also debugging a slightly harder static website that makes an API call to a Studio Ghibli API. So the websites look kind of broken right now, but don't worry, we will debug together. And at the end of the workshop, there'll just be like 2 sites and they should be working. I'll actually demo that right now. Oops. So if you go into the repo, you should see 2 folders. One is called Debug Me. The other one is called Fixed Me. Obviously, Debug Me is filled with a few bugs, and then the Fixed Me is the exact same structurally, but it doesn't have any bugs. So if you're feeling lost on how you think it should look like, please refer to Fixed Me. And you can right-click and then open with Live Server, and then you should be able to see it locally. So this is what you should be expecting once we're done all of our debugging, and then the Studio Ghibli website should look something like this. So that will be the goal by the end of this workshop. And yep, workshop timeline, a very brief recap of HTML and CSS. And then we are going to be walking through debugging the portfolio together. And then we're going to have an introduction to HTTP requests and APIs. And then we'll be debugging the Studio Ghibli API together. So HTML and CSS. Sorry if this might be redundant for you if you've attended the previous workshop, so I'll try and keep it short and sweet. So rather than your typical logical programming language like Java, Python, or maybe even Racket, I guess, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and it's mainly used to establish the structure, layout, and presentation of a web page and its content. So web browsers read and display documents that contain HTML. And HTML is composed of many elements which are contained within tags. For example, they can be paragraphs, headings, body, links, or bullet points. And these elements are often nested within each other. So for example, a bunch of bullet points within a paragraph. And we'll just do a quick recap of the syntax. So angle brackets like this contain tags, which usually open and close with a backslash with a close tag. One of the few exceptions to this is like an image tag where it doesn't have a close tag. And yeah, within the open and close tag, there's just the element context. And this is the basic HTML document structure. So it'll always look something like this. Jenny went over this, so I won't be going too much into depth, but if you are interested, you can also refer to MDN docs. And also, I had a section on common HTML tags in the Notion, so if you wanted to read more into that, please refer there. But now we are moving on to CSS. So cascading style sheets is used to style and lay out web pages. So things like font, color, size, placement of content, and even animations if you want. So basically in CSS, you define things called style rules for specific web page elements or even groups of elements. And HTML documents usually reference at least one style sheet to bring style to their element. Here is an overview of CSS syntax. So at the very beginning, you have what's called a selector. So that selects the tag or the ID or class that you give it. And then within the curly brackets, you have a bunch of style properties associated with values. So for example, color, font size, and font weight are all style properties, and then we assign them values based on what we want. And remember how we said that headings was like one of the common HTML elements? Well, if you select like H1, which is just one of the many heading tags, you can actually customize it. And then if it's not a predefined tag, you can also create one, or you can use IDs or classes. And then speaking of IDs and classes, IDs are unique, and basically what this means is that each HTML element can only have one ID. So in this example, if I had another ID here, it would not apply. And then you can reference it in your style sheet using the hashtag right before the selector. And then classes are not unique. So this is like for the previous workshop, if you had like repetitive elements or something that you would be using commonly throughout your website, you would probably use a class instead of an ID. And this can be applied to many elements. And then an HTML element can also have multiple class attributes. Okay, so let's actually jump right into debugging the portfolio. So I will exit my screen share. And then if you haven't already, please clone the GitHub repo into VS Code or any other text editor. And then when you start up VS Code, you will see these two directories, and then click into the Debug Me folder. And then you can right click on index.html. So that is the portfolio website, and then Studio Ghibli is the other one. So if you right click and then open with live server, you should be able to see it, the broken one in your local server. Alternatively, you can also find it, you can open it in your Finder. So right click and then reveal in Finder if you don't have the live server extension installed, and then you can just double click on that, and that should do the same thing. Yeah. And then every time you hit save, this is what the live server extension does. It should save your changes, and then your changes should be reflected on your local server. Nice. Okay, so we're going to start with this portfolio site first. The first bug that we have is actually just centering content. So you might have seen the meme. If you haven't Googled how to center a div at least once, are you even a programmer? So basically, we want all of this content, or like the intro, the blurb, and the social media icons to be centered like smack in the middle of the page because it looks really wonky right now. So what we're going to do first is we're going to use developer tools to get a sense of where everything is. If you haven't taken a look at the code already, no worries. Oftentimes you'll be working in like a code base that you're not familiar with, and that's totally fine. You just need to know how to Google. So we are going to go in here and then right click and then inspect, and this will bring up your developer panel. So as you can see, this is the HTML document. If you hover over each of these elements, it'll highlight the corresponding element in the website for you. And what you can also do instead of hovering here is that you can go click on the cursor, select an element in the page to inspect it. So I can select this one and it'll show which HTML element I'm selecting. So for this example, if you're just playing around, you can actually see that there's two of these divs right here, and they're contained within a div, this giant div, with an ID already called centered. So we're going to assume that's the CSS ID that's responsible for centering that div and the elements, its children elements. So we're actually going to go take a look at that and see what's happening there. So now you can refer to the style.css file, and then you can go find the corresponding ID, and this is what we see. Okay, maybe this doesn't make sense to you, but that's okay, because we are going to Google. Google, if you haven't already, how to center a div. You will probably see W3 Schools first. This is a very good beginner website to reference if you're learning web dev for the first time. I used it a lot, and it actually has a lot of content. And then you'll probably see some other websites. But the thing that we're looking for here, or you might be looking for like a quick and easy answer, is something called Stack Overflow. So Stack Overflow is basically a website where people ask questions about whatever code they're writing, and a lot of people answer. So how should we navigate Stack Overflow? So Stack Overflow is arguably a debugger's best friend, but a lot of these answers are often outdated and not very relevant anymore. So as you can see here, this question was actually asked 12 years ago. That's quite a long time ago. And so obviously software updates, and there might be a better answer for you if you just know where to look. So we can scroll down and we see, oh, this has actually been answered in like June of 2010, which is interesting. And then this is like 2016, whatever. And then oftentimes these answers, like someone will post an original answer, but then they'll come back and edit it with a better answer. So we can see here that, oh, they say you can actually do something called Flexbox, or use a CSS style called Flexbox. It is very easy to style the div horizontally and vertically centered. And then if we pull up our VS Code here, I'm just going to, if we reference the centered selector in our CSS document, we actually see that someone has already written something like very similar to this. You see that there's a flex direction, and then this is talking about having a flex box, display flex, justify content. We're like, what is this? But maybe you don't know what a Flexbox is. So we are going to go onto this website, and you can actually find this website if you Google anything very CSS related, because it's a very popular website. It's called CSS Tricks. So you can see here that there's usually like very good guides and documentation for very like beginner friendly things. So this is a comprehensive guide to CSS Flexbox layout. So we see that they have properties for the parent container as well as properties for the children container. And then if we go back to our website, we saw that this div with ID equals centered is actually a parent container for these two smaller children, these two right here. And then we're like, okay, that's what we're referencing. So then we see that there's a bunch of CSS style properties that this guide kind of lays out for us. So I think we saw flex direction in the Stack Overflow, flex wrap, and then we have actually justified content in our own code. So we can tell that this, obviously someone is trying to use the Flexbox property, but maybe they're just not doing it right. And actually, if you read this, the very first thing for a property for the parent container is this style property called display. So this enables a flex context for all its direct children. So if you actually don't have this, then your children won't have the flex context enabled. And we actually see here that we have all these other flex properties, except we don't have display flex. So we are actually going to add that because that it's missing the property that makes the element a flex container. And then this, oops, caps, display flex. And then we are going to hit save and then see if anything happens. Oh, wow, that's very nice. Let's see what's happening here. So these two are now centered in its parent container, which is exactly what we wanted. So even though you're navigating Codebase and you don't know what Flexbox is, you can quickly and easily find a guide for it, and it's laid out very well. Okay, so we are going to go on to our next bug, which is very similar in the sense that it also deals with Flexbox. So now that we've introduced that concept, you might be thinking that it would be the perfect container for these little icons because they also look a bit awkward vertically. We kind of want them to be like in a line. Again, you can use your developer tools. Oops. And then you can hover over them to see their styles and their elements. So if we click into one of them, we'll see that these are all A tags. And then within each tag, there's a div with a corresponding class for the social media icon. So they seem to be in a vertical stack, but I think we know what to reference now because we've seen the Flexbox documentation. So if you just scroll down, you know that you're trying to center, you're trying to center these children, and you kind of want to wrap it in something called this parent container, and you want it to look something like horizontally. And then the second thing on this guide is actually something called flex direction. So there's 4 flex directions. There's row, row reverse, column, and column reverse, and they're very nicely laid out for you visually here. And we will be applying flex direction row. So that's the normal one. Usually it's row. And then we see if we go to our HTML, we can see all the tags here. And then it doesn't already, unlike the centered div at the very top, it doesn't already have a class selector or style selector, So we can create one for it. And then to create one, you just simply go to your style.css file, and then we can add a class for now. So we can call this whatever we want, but usually you want to call it something that describes what it's doing. So I'm just going to call it a social media div. And then like we said before, we wanted it to be a Flexbox. So we can say display flex, and then we wanted the flex direction to be row from the guide. And then just to make it look nicer, I'm just going to give it some padding. And then if we hit save and we have our live server open, you should be able to see the changes. And if you don't have live server open, again, you can just go in the Finder and double click. Oh, what's wrong? Oh, we haven't applied it to the actual HTML element yet. So to apply a style, you have to reference the actual selector in style.css. So we are going to say class. We named it social media div, and it autofills for you very nicely. And now, wow, they are in a row. Beautiful. Okay, so that's our second bug down, actually. We are moving decently fast. And then the third bug is actually very silly, but maybe some of you saw when I was demonstrating this, when I was hovering over this, there was actually an invisible icon. We don't know where it is, but we can see that it exists because you can see the corresponding HTML element, and when you hover it, it actually gives you something. So this looks like it's similarly structured to all the other ones. So we're actually going to find the class inside our code. So you can see all of these. Can I zoom in? Oh, here we go. Zoom in a little bit because I know that was an issue before. Okay, sorry, I should have done that earlier, but I forgot. And then we can actually see for each different social media link, we give it its own class as well as a link. So this is how you assign multiple classes to a div or an element. And then we're just going to click into the Facebook style because we don't know what's going on there. And if we look at our code, we see that all of these icons have a background image. So that's what you see as the icon itself. And then it also has a width and height. We're like, okay, these all seem right. And then the only one that looks a bit different is the one for Facebook. It's missing like the dot and then the slash. So basically that's a relative path error. You're basically trying to reference a background image from where you are right now, which is in style.css. So if you don't know already, the dot slash just goes up one directory, and then it finds this image folder, or images folder, sorry, and then it picks the corresponding asset that it wants to use. And then a trick here is that to see if your relative path is correct, you can hold down the command key and then click into one, and then it should show you the icon if you've referenced it correctly. And if we try to do that with the Facebook one, we see that it actually doesn't work because you're giving it the wrong path. So we are actually just going to fix that and then save. And then, wow, we have the Facebook icon back. Now we're actually going to move on to the next one, which will touch a bit more on not CSS. So if you've gone a step further and gone into the prerequisites, the optional prerequisites, you've probably already seen this facts container in script.js. this thing basically. And then if we open what it's supposed to look like, I can demo what we should be expecting. So basically, after your little blurb, you should be able to click on this here word to get a random fact about yourself or whatever you put. So if I click this, I should be able to see this div here populate with random facts. And I can see that it's a div if I inspect element. And then it's a div with an ID called fact container. And then it basically updates whenever I press here for a random fact. And then if you look at our broken website and you try to click here, nothing actually happens. So we are going to try and fix that. Oops. So we're going to go into script.js to see what's actually happening. And basically, actually I'll show you here first. If you hover over the here word, you can see that it's an A tag. And then when you click it, it actually triggers this JavaScript function called add random fact. I think my screen is a bit, this text is like really small, but basically, yeah, I don't know if you can see it, but if you hover it on your local server, it should also say href equals, and then the target would be add random fact. So it's referring to this function here. So what is this doing? Okay, we are looking at an array of facts, and then what the logic behind this function is actually pretty simple. It just has an array, and then it just picks a random index or element in the array. So we're actually going to inspect the problem by doing this thing called console.log. It's very useful in JavaScript, or actually in any other language. You're just printing out what you want to see. So in this case, we want to see what our fact is, because we want to see if it's actually getting the fact from our array. So if we console log that and hit save, we can go back to our local server, and then now every time you click the here word in your web page, you should be able to see something appear in the console because we just console logged it. So if I click here, you can see my console populating with all of these facts. And it's very clear that this function itself is working, but the div is still not getting populated anyways. And the problem with that is that you can see that there is the div, but it's never updating. So if we actually go back to our function, we know that this function is actually working, but the thing we're not doing is actually, we're not appending it to the document object model, which is the DOM. So we're not putting it onto the page. We're just, logically, we are generating a fact, but we're not putting it on the page anywhere. So to do that, we just need to use JavaScript to get the fact container div element, because as we saw, the div had an ID called fact container, and then I'm not sure if, yeah, so it doesn't really have that much styling. So we are going to go into here, and then to grab that specific div, we are going to use document.getElementById. So we are going to say const fact container equals, and then we are going to reference our document, and then get element by ID, and then we will pass in the ID. And then now what we want to do is we want to basically put the fact that we just got from the function into this div element. So you can do fact container, and then this is, so this is a property to manipulate the DOM. It's called .innerText, and then we're just going to set that to fact. And then we are going to hit save, and then hopefully it will work now. And we didn't get rid of the console log just so that we can see that it's working. Oh, and now it's working. So now if you go into your elements here, oh, it's not, oh, I guess it doesn't want to work. But if you go, oh, I think my dev tools kind of froze. Let me refresh. Or everything just kind of froze. I'm going to restart the server. Okay, so like I was saying, if you go into here and then you select the fact container here, and then you click here, you should be able to see the inner text that you just set, which is nice. You can see it working. Okay, and that bug is actually the last bug that we have for the portfolio. So now we're going to go into a quick intro to APIs and network requests tangent. Okay, so this is very beginner friendly and will not cover that much, but there's a lot to APIs and network requests. So if you are interested, please refer to basically any website or source on the internet, such as MD and Docs. We love that one. And yeah, I'll just dive into it. So what is an API? An API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's something that simply sends information back and forth between a user and an application. So how does this relate to web applications, or what we're doing right now? Everything on the web can be thought of as a large network of connected servers. So for example, the local host server that you just spun up with VS Code's FileShare extension is a local server on your laptop. And here is a nice flow diagram of what happens. So for example, when you go visit, let's say, google.com in your browser, and your browser being Chrome, Safari, Edge, or whatever you use, it sends this thing called a request to Google's remote server, and then it receives a response, and then it displays the information to you. So it interprets the code, and then it displays it on the document. So here the browser is what we would call the client, and then that client would call the API. So basically every time you visit a website, your browser is interacting with an API that's hosted by the remote server. So how do we communicate with an API? So to receive or send information to an API, there is a specific thing called a request URL that sends back data. So this is known as the API response, which is commonly in like a JSON format. We will dive into that later, but this network request is this thing called an HTTP request, and that stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And this is used to structure requests and responses over the internet. Now we're going to go over some common elements of a network request. So the first thing, or the most important thing maybe, is the HTTP method. So what are you trying to do? You could be trying to get like information from a website, or you could be trying to send information to the API endpoint. So for example, if you're filling out a form, and then when you click the send button, you want your form data to be sent to the endpoint, or you want to update something in a database. So the most common HTTP methods are GET to fetch data from the API, or POST to send information to the API. And then the other element of the request that we need is the path of the resource, and this is also known as the request URL or the endpoint. And then other optional things that we need are headers. Headers basically provide additional context information for your request, and then the body can provide any other information you want to send. So, and this is commonly in the form of a JSON object or array. So we are going to look at our API that we're going to be working with today. It's called the Studio Ghibli API. So basically all APIs have documentation, which is extremely useful for debugging. So this includes information on how we want to format your requests and what response that you should be expecting back from the API. API documentation also includes status code tables with the status code and the corresponding error description. And as you'll tell, this is super useful. So we are actually going to go into the documentation. So if you want to take a look at this yourself, it's ghibliapi.herokuapp.com and it's linked in the Notion. So this is what typical API documentation looks like. There's usually sections on how to use it, endpoints, workflows, authentication if there's any. So for example, if you were using the Spotify API, you would have to authenticate with the user's account. But in this case, since this is a very simple API, there is no authentication necessary. So it's very good that we don't have to worry about that today. And then there's a list of endpoints. So it'll tell you what parameters you could send and what responses you could get back. So this is like just a manual on how to use it. And the good thing about this API is that it's really simple. So all of the endpoints are GET requests, and that's what we will be working with today. Yeah, so we will be working with the films endpoint today. So if you read it, it says the films endpoint returns information about all of the Studio Ghibli films, and then to the right of the screen, there is a response sample. So with status code 200, you should be expecting an array of films to be returned to you. So you can see that this is an array, and then for each element in the array, it's basically a film with properties. So it's an object, and then it has properties and then values. Let's dive right in. We are going to do a quick overview of Fetch right before we get debugging. So JavaScript Fetch is a way to send network requests to obtain or send information without reloading the page. So for example, this could be requesting user information, submitting a form like we said before, or even for our use case, grabbing a list of Studio Ghibli films from an API endpoint. So it's a more modern method compared to older HTTP request methods. And the basic syntax of this is that you fetch and then you pass in the request URL or the endpoint, and you can pass in optional parameters. So this actually returns a promise that resolves to the API response. We are not going to get into promises today because that is way too much for this workshop, I think, to cover fully. So basically what you need to know is that once this fetch method completes, it's just a promise, and then you can also access the API response, which is what we want. MDN also has very detailed documentation on the fetch method, and in our example, we are using fetch to make a GET request to this films endpoint, as we saw earlier. And then, as we saw, we should be expecting a response of 200 with an array of films. And now we can close this because we are finished. And then we can spin up another live server, but this time with the Studio Ghibli HTML. And you see that it's very blank except for the logo that we reference locally. So it seems like a blank page. So where are all the films that we're expecting? So again, we can inspect element, and then this is something that we haven't seen before with the portfolio website, but there's this kind of scary red line that says, fail to load resource. The server responded with a status of 404 not found. And on the right, it actually says that resource is the Ghibli API. And then if this is in the console right now, but if you go to network, so basically network has all the network requests. And then you can see that there's some local ones, such as the JavaScript file, and then the HTML doc. And then you see film, and then you can click on it and verify the request method, status code, which is 404, not found, and then the URL. So usually when you have something that's not like 200 or an OK API response, you would go to the API documentation, and then you would actually look at the responses. So right now there's only 3 responses that we can get back, either an OK or bad request or not found. So right now we have not found, and then not found usually, or like in some cases, it refers to not finding the request URL you were trying to reference. So if we look at this request sample, it has the request URL, and then we can compare that to what we are calling an error code. So we can go to script, and we can open Ghibli script. And then here, I've provided a hint for you if you've already seen, but it says, are we sure that's the right endpoint? And then it looks all right, but then if you compare it very closely with the actual endpoint, we should be using films, not singular. So it's like sometimes the nitty-gritty stuff like this that gets you, and it's really annoying, but you learn to live with it. So we are going to save, and then hopefully something happens. Oh wow, okay. So the page is still pretty blank, but the thing is, if you go into console, you don't see that scary red line anymore. And then if you go into network, you can see that all of your network requests are okay. And then if you click on the films network request, now it returns a status code of 200 okay, which is what we want. But for some reason, we still aren't seeing the films displayed. So that is actually our last and final bug. So basically, the page is still empty, even though we just fixed the request URL/API endpoint. And then we just did the second bullet point, which was just to check the network request and response status. So again, we're going to go into the JavaScript file to see how we're handling the API response in our code. Okay, so after the fetch returns a promise, and then after that resolves with the API response, so then we get back the API response and we want to access the data. But we are expecting data back that looks something like an array. But I don't think we're getting that. So we can console log again and see what is going on. Oops. You can Command S like always, and then you see this new thing here, and I don't know if I can zoom into, there we go, because it's kind of chunky. Basically, this console log shows you the response, and it doesn't look like what we're expecting here at all, because this is just an array of films. But instead, we see this response thing. So basically, oh, status code, okay, cool. And then body. Body is actually what we want. So basically, what's happening here, if you haven't worked with API responses before, is that basically this response is the API response itself and not the API response body. So here you can actually access the status code, and then based on the status code, if you're coding something else, you can throw different kinds of errors and display different kinds of error codes. So what we actually want is the body of like this readable stream. But in order to get that, we have to obtain this response body using the JSON method. So in order to obtain the response body from the response stream, we have to use JSON, which basically parses this body text as JSON into a JSON object, so something that we can actually make sense of. Otherwise, it's just a stream. So we are actually going to look at the documentation for that as well. So basically, yeah, this takes a read response stream and then reads it to completion. It returns a promise. So we are just going to do that. A promise that resolves to a JavaScript object. So this could be anything that is represented by JSON. So what we would be expecting after we call the JSON method is something that resolves to a JSON object. So, which is perfect because we were expecting an array of films anyways. So let's incorporate that into our code. So right now, data is the response stream. So I'm just going to rename that so we don't get confused. Response, and then we're just going to return response and see what happens. Where does this end? I cannot see. Then this should be, you should be returning, sorry, response.json. So now this is the response body that you want to work with. So then this promise should return the actual body. So now we can call this data, and then we should be able to access the array contents from there. Actually, there is an error. What did I do? Oh, I see. Syntax. Okay. So actually, we want to console log data as well, just to be sure that we're doing this right. Doesn't hurt to console log a lot. So I hit Command S. Oh, and now we see something. Wow, okay, so this is a response. And then what you see here, the 20, the array of size 20 is basically the response body. So as you can see, these are, this resembles like the ID, title, whatever, this resembles the expected API response in the API documentation. So that is what we want. And then you can also see everything here. You can access a lot of things in each film, but right now, what the code does is basically gets the title, gets the description, and then it displays it on the page. Similarly to how we displayed our facts on the page, it just populates the document by creating an element and then appending it to the root. So if you're interested in the Notion, there's actually a tutorial that I referenced. That's how I actually started learning all this stuff. Yeah, so now you can see that everything is working. You have parsed the stream into a JSON object that you can now access. And yeah, now you should have 2 of these pages under Debug Me, and they should all resemble what's inside the Fixed Me folder. And then you can, if you want, you can make this your own personal portfolio and populate it with your own facts. And then I hope that you can use this very base information to help you with your beginner hackathon project next weekend at Command F. So wrapping it up, well done. If you haven't already, refresh your local server to see your changes, and congrats, you've fixed all the bugs. And I hope you learned something and gotten a better beginner intuition of how debugging works like, how debugging looks like in front-end web dev. And thank you so much for attending. If you have any questions, please let us know. And slides and the recording of this workshop will be posted online later, probably on our Twitch first, then the YouTube. And then everything is also in Discord, so if you want the Notion link, I'll just show you the Notion page quickly. It basically has everything that we went through today. So if you would like a reference to this and then go through it on your own, there's GIFs as well to help you get started. I will also post that in the Discord. So thank you so much for coming, and you can see my stream right now because I'm streaming. But yeah, thank you for coming to this workshop, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.